again, everyone, and welcome to our keynote address for this afternoon. I will be moderating the keynote today, introducing our keynote speaker, Dr. Akiemi Glenn, and moderating the Q&A portion, the question and answer following the keynote address. So before doing so, I'd like to introduce myself. If you attended the last panel, then you already know me, but if not, my name is Joshua Wipi. Also Siosua Semisi Talua Wipi. My father, Talua Ki Moanolatu Wipi, was born in Hauteo Tapu. Our family traces their lineage to Whakakai, Pa'apai, and King of Otonga. My mother, Melinda Suzanne Wipi, was born in Berkeley, California, and is of English, Scottish, Irish, and Scandinavian descent. I'm a PhD student here at UH Mānoa, and I'm also a lecturer in the Pacific Island Studies department and the head of this planning committee for this whole thing. Then I'll be moderating, as I said. If you have any questions for our keynote speaker, please enter them into the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to them at the end of the address. And now I'd like to introduce our keynote for this afternoon, Dr. Akiemi Glenn. Dr. Glenn is a Honolulu-based scholar and culture worker. As a linguist who works in Indigenous language revitalization, filmmaker, artist, and cultural practitioner, her works engage concepts of culture, race, and belonging at the intersections of art, social justice, and education. She's the founder and executive director of the Pōpolo Project, an organization whose mission is to redefine what it means to be Black in Hawaii through cultivating connections between individuals, our communities, our ancestors, and the land, highlighting the vivid, complex diversity of Black cultures and identities in the Pacific and around the world. Dr. Glenn holds an MA and Ph.D. in linguistics from the University of Hawai at Mānoa and a BA in linguistics from New York University. Dr. Glenn will be delivering our keynote for this afternoon, as you know, and I'd like to welcome her to our conference. Our committee felt that Dr. Glenn would be a wonderful resource for us for topics related to our conference, and we're very excited and very grateful for Dr. Glenn joining us. And with that being said, I will turn it over to Dr. Glenn.
Mahalo, Josh. Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm so grateful for the invitation to speak with you all today. And we were just talking before we came on about how important it has been for this conference to continue, especially considering the last year that we've all endured. And I'm really grateful to be able to lend my voice to some of the conversations that have been going on since this CPIS conference has been underway today. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen with you, so please bear with me for just a minute. I have been really excited thinking about speaking with the group this afternoon as a part of this keynote address at the end of this eventful day. Of course, when I was asked to be a part of this conference as a keynote speaker, I was really thinking about myself and what I had to offer in a few different ways. Of course, first, I was thinking of my experience as a grad student at UH Mānoa and someone who was around the Pacific Island Studies Center for many years and who situated my work, my scholarly work, and also my community work in relation to Pacific Islander communities. I also thought about the work that I'm doing now at the Pōpolo Project and my own identity as a Black person who is not Pacific Islander, but who is Black, from a very diverse lineage myself, who found myself here in the Pacific and was called to do this work in community with people who wanted to look at how diaspora and language and all of these things intersect. And so today I thought it would be important as we start this conversation and as we engage with some of these ideas and think about navigating into new spaces, unfamiliar spaces, that I kind of start with where I come from and how I was able to come into Pacific Island Studies and where that's taken me. So this afternoon, I'd like to start with questions about where we find ourselves. A lot of my work these days is, as one of my friends says, as a public Black person where I talk about being Black in the Pacific. And of course, at the Pōpolo Project, as Josh mentioned in the introduction, we work at redefining what Blackness means in Hawaii and in our region of the Pacific by really insisting on humanizing the people who are experiencing life through the lens of a racialized identity. And of course, that brings us into really interesting conversations. So you have people like me who are of African descent and descendants of people who were trafficked and enslaved in the Americas, who found our way to the Pacific. But you also have people who are Indigenous Pacific Islanders who are also considered Black. And so today, as I think about how we can start to have new tools to navigate these spaces, I think that convergence is really important for how I have found myself in this work and how I bring the lenses of my ancestors and my own lineage to engage with the Pacific and with Pacific Island studies in general. And, you know, as I was preparing for this keynote, I thought about some of my experiences as a student. And as I just said, as a Black person, as a Black woman in Pacific Island studies and linguistics more broadly. And reflecting on my time at UH Mānoa was a really generative time. It was a really important time for me as a scholar, as a young scholar, coming into new understandings of the histories of this place, learning new methodologies. But it was also a really important crucible for me to kind of understand what my positionality brought to my scholarship and to my community work. And thinking about Blackness in a Pacific context wasn't something that I kind of jumped into in an academic way. I was really interested in Indigenous language revitalization and community work. And not to say that my Blackness or my Black identity was secondary, but that was not the primary lens through which I was approaching my work. However, being a young Black woman in the academy, lots of people reminded me of my Blackness all the time. And not only in ways that were challenging and difficult, but in ways that were also liberatory. I think about a number of experiences as a grad student. One I recently talked about with a colleague that'll be in a published piece soon. But I remember being in a seminar on oceanic linguistics, so the languages of the entire region, and kind of doing a survey and learning about the history. And one of the professors in that seminar started to talk about the phenotypes, about the physical characteristics of people in so-called Melanesia. And he turned to me and used my body and my presence as a teaching tool. And I'll never forget this because he talked about my crispy hair, and he talked about the shape of my chin, my jaw, the shape of my eyebrows, and used me as a tool to be able to demonstrate what an absent in this class at that time, what an absent Melanesian body might look like. And that was something that was a really salient memory of mine. It was many years ago now, but it was something that spurred me to think about the ways that Blackness has been constructed, the ways that race has been constructed in the Pacific region, and why it was that my professor, who is one of the most respected scholars in his field, felt comfortable engaging with me as a junior scholar in that way and objectifying me, not only me, Akiemi sitting in the classroom, but also all of these absent people who were not in this classroom, who had very different genealogies and lineages from myself. And it was something that really animated a lot of my curiosity. And so today, the piece that I'm hoping to talk with you all about and will kind of be the centerpiece of this talk comes from that experience. I think it's important as we think about how we situate ourselves, that we also think about where race shows up in Pacific Island studies. And those of you who are tuning in today might have different reasons for having been interested in this keynote. But I think one of the things that's really key and important when we start this conversation is to acknowledge that we often don't talk about race in Pacific Island studies. There's a real focus on the kind of anthropological over the many years of the history of this discipline, and especially in area studies. And there's a real focus on centering the concept of the native and the indigenous as a way to understand how people move in culture and how culture's changed over time. There's of course a different swell that's kind of coming through the discipline now and through the different disciplines that make up Pacific Island studies that are compelling us to look at things like race and power. But it's important before we go further in the talk this afternoon that we just have some definitions that we can all wrap our hands around. So for me today, when I talk about race, I'm talking about a social construction that is based on stigmas and categorizations that allow nation states and those who run nation states to hold power. And these are historically tied and historically developed over time. And it's important that in thinking about race that we acknowledge that it's a process. It's not something that's intrinsic or essential to a person or a community. It's something that has been reinforced through policy and culture moves and all of these different kinds of structures that humans get to make decisions about. And it's done not just because people have prejudices or because people haven't encountered folks who look different from them, but it's done specifically because it allows relationships of domination and subordination to continue. And the reason that those relationships are unequal and hierarchized is so that they can produce a material reality that allows those who run nation states or empires to hold on to value that's been produced either by land or people. And it's important that we kind of have this because I think a lot of the discourse, and certainly in the last year, as people are starting to think about race in very explicit ways, reverts to this idea that race is just about difference. Difference is a part of how we mark race and how Western world and Western European culture has exported race around the world. But it's been done not just as a byproduct of the movement of Western peoples around the world through colonialism and exploration and extraction and capitalism, but it's actually something that reinforces their ability to hold on to value and expropriate value from all sorts of people around the world. It's also important, I think, always when we talk about the Pacific, that we acknowledge that while I'm talking about Blackness in very broad terms that encompass someone like me, who is from the Atlantic side of the world, and people in the Pacific, that these connections are not necessarily natural. Humans are making these connections. And there's a question, who raced the islands? Who made the islands broken up into the racial divisions that we've seen? And I'm sure all of us in this room today who are interested in Pacific Island studies and the experiences of Pacific Islanders are well acquainted with some of that history, especially the French people who found that it was easier and better and also serving their imperial aims to be able to classify people of this region. Of course, one of the first is Charles de Brosse in 1756, who himself didn't set foot in the Pacific, but kind of edited a compendium of explorers' reports. And he's one of the first people to start thinking about and talking about distinct areas such as Polynesia. By the early 19th century, there was an idea of Melanesia, Micronesia, and Polynesia as distinct racialized groupings that were distributed over a geographical area. This is really important because Europe had already discovered and spent time in other parts of the world, so-called discovered, and spent time in other parts of the world where one of the first things that they did was start to categorize people. And part of this categorization was marking people for whether they could be potential allies, whether they could be used as colonial agents, and whether they were useful as labor, or whether they were just not useful at all. And we see that the process of racialization and racing these islands was really crucial to the ways that colonial agents engaged with this place. And it's important for the story that we'll tell today. So I mentioned that I was a student at UH Mānoa, and in those years, as a student, I spent a lot of years in Moore Hall, which some of you might have spent time in the before times when we weren't just doing everything on Zoom. And in Moore Hall on the 5th floor where the linguistics department is, there was a box that at the end of semesters, we would find discarded pieces of all different kinds of ephemera from professors and graduate students and others. People would get rid of some old dictionary that someone had given them, or a book that they didn't need anymore, course books. And it was just this kind of place where there was this free exchange of material. When I was a student many years ago, one end of semester, I happened across this box and found these two pieces: Melanesian Pidgin English, grammar text and vocabulary, and the Melanesian Pidgin phrasebook and vocabulary. Both are by a linguist named Robert Hall. Both are produced in 1943, and both were just little pieces of paper kind of tucked away in the bottom of this box. And as a student who was curious about this region and interested in anything I could get my hands on, especially about Pacific languages, and maybe a little bit of a proto-hoarder who was collecting any academic books I could get my hands on for free, I took these home and spent some time with them. I was in particular really interested in the history of these documents. I recognize the Linguistic Society of America. It's the foremost professional organization for the discipline of linguistics in the US and around the world, really. But I was also kind of confused and interested in this United States Armed Forces Institute and this intensive language program. Many of us in linguistics, especially at UH, were aware of the history of the US State Department and the US military before them in investing in Pacific Island languages as a strategic investment. So I took these home and I read them with rapt interest. And I was really curious about Melanesian Pidgin in general. And without spending too much time on Melanesian Pidgin and what it is, if you're interested, I encourage you to check out this really fascinating story of a series of languages that are interrelated. But pidgins are languages that are created for trade interactions and transactions in general. Of course, we still use the term pidgin to refer to lots of languages that are used on a everyday beyond the transaction basis. But the word pidgin comes from a pidgin itself from southern China that was used in interactions between English colonists and traders and people in southern China. And itself is a version of the pronunciation of the word business, pidgin. So I was familiar with Melanesian Pidgin just from my linguistic studies and was curious about this particular phrase book. So pretty standard when I encountered it. Linguist Robert Hall, he at the time was at Cornell University and did not spend time in the Pacific either. And I think that's interesting, thinking about the ways that people have pronounced things about the Pacific from secondhand accounts. And I think it's interesting in looking at these particular documents that Hall produced, that he, right up at front, the very first thing that I read, the first thing that kind of leapt out at me was his explanations for what these books were and what they were for. And of course, he describes here the point of this phrase book and vocabulary in particular is so that natives and white men can communicate. And I think it's interesting that he talks about if a white man wishes to understand a native or tell him something, and this is my emphasis in this reproduction here, he has a much better chance of doing so if he knows and is able to use at least a few words of Pidgin. So as a linguist interested in these languages, someone who's interested in the Pacific, there are a couple of things that leap out to me in this passage. One, we can imagine that we're thinking of the islands of Melanesia, which themselves are diverse and vast and complicated, and some of the most linguistically rich places on the planet Earth, that the presumption is that if Euro-Americans, in this case, in particular, American GIs, want to communicate with Indigenous people, that they do it on their own terms, essentially using a version of Pidgin English. And there's no presumption anywhere in this particular text that, say, a foreigner coming to any of the islands that use Melanesian Pidgin should learn any of the native languages there. That's another solution, certainly. But it's a kind of a time capsule of what 1940s American life was like, what it was like during the war, and also what our discipline was like at the time. This particular phrase book is very standard. If you're familiar with the ways that linguists often do language descriptions, there's the holy trinity of grammar, vocabulary, texts. The grammar is the rules of the language, how to put words together, what are the smallest units of sound. Vocabulary is just a long glossary, a running list of words that you might need. And then texts are larger pieces of conversation sometimes, or stories that are told by informants. And the idea there is to give us a picture of what language looks like above the sentence level, how people talk, how people contextualize language in their daily lives. And in this particular collection of grammar, vocabulary, and texts, there are also a set of useful phrases and then a punitive expedition script, which I'll spend a little more time on later. But it was really striking to me as a young student looking at this. In the list of useful phrases, there were items like this. There were many of them, and there are too many to assault our eyes with for this afternoon. But it was really interesting to me and really apparent that this was a colonial text that was very much about prescribing the kind of interactions that American GIs, presumed to be white people, would be having with Indigenous people in the islands that they encountered. And you can see in the bolded items here that there's interesting parallels between master and white men in the ways that this is presented. And this idea of using boy, which to many of us who are familiar with the linguistic function of white supremacy in the Atlantic world, recognize as a way to denigrate and infantilize, in particular, Black men. We see this here as something that's not only a description of what could be said in Melanesian Pidgin, but is actually recommended for the GIs using this book to address Indigenous people in this way. And it was really striking to me that not only is this just something faithfully reproduced, but there's a note here that says all male natives are called boys, no matter how old they are. And this was really striking. And then I got into the punitive expedition text. The punitive expedition has been a really interesting thing to kind of delve into. This is a text you'll see on the left that in linguistic kind of methodology, we try to faithfully represent the language as it's spoken, and then do something called a line by line gloss, which is to break up all of the pieces of the words above and explain kind of grammatically how they fit together. So it might look very different for a given language than it appears in English. And then you'll see on the right that we have something that we call the free translation, which is an explanation of what the text means, or someone who is fluent enough in the language can kind of explain to you what the intention of the text is in language that's fluent and fluid in English or the target language. And you can see in the free translation, if you're not particularly fluent in Melanesian Pidgin, that this is a attestation by someone who describes himself as a police boy, thinking about the ways that boy is used in colonial situations to infantilize. He's a native policeman. And he talks about his comportment as a policeman and that he was always good, but not all the natives were like this. And so they were all continually fighting. He talks about the fact that when the colonial authorities hear about the fighting, whatever that may be, he was authorized to go into the bush and to restore order. And this is a really interesting kind of setup. So this comes from someone's text, his witness account of what they were doing. And then what we see on the next pages are the actual text of what becomes a punitive expedition. If you're not familiar with the phrase punitive expedition, this phrase was used in a lot of British and French colonial descriptions for the kind of march into a colonial holding to be able to mete out justice, as the colonizers saw it, to the natives. So if natives had been insubordinate in any way, it would be a way for colonial authorities to make their violence and their power known. So this punitive expedition is something that's included as part of the useful phrases and useful understanding of Melanesian Pidgin that was provided to GIs in 1943. So you can imagine that as an American GI, whoever they might be from whatever small town, possibly in North America, is encountering Melanesian people, so-called Melanesian people in their homelands. And they see these folks in the ways that they have been trained to understand racialized people in the places that they come from. And now they're being prescribed how to engage with Indigenous people. And this handbook essentially is telling them what they should expect. And a punitive expedition is one of the things that's on the table. You might need these words, you might need these phrases to be able to go and restore order in the interior or in the bush. I'm sharing with you here the text of the punitive expedition script, and it's several lines long. This punitive expedition basically is a drama. It shows what the writer anticipated based on that short witness account of the so-called police boy, what might happen in the interior. And so on on the left, you'll see in bold all of the Melanesian pidgin representations. This is presumably what the GI or user of this handbook would need to know to understand. And then on the right in the ITAL, you see the English free translation. So you see from the very beginning, the very first line, we're talking about backwoods natives, this idea of people who are outside of modernity, people who need to be brought into colonial understanding, people who are not good inherently. You see all of these really interesting and very loaded presentations of Indigenous people in these spaces. You see in line 6, the police boys who go on the river in native boats. You see police boys throughout this. And then at the very final line of this section, line 13, we get to this place where 2 men are fighting. So imagine this, that we've heard all of the efforts that have gone into marshaling this expedition into the bush to stop 2 men from fighting. You start to get a sense of over-policing that seems a little bit familiar to us, especially in this last year, as we've seen the ways that law enforcement metes out violence against Black bodies. The next lines, these 2 men are fighting. The policeman or the colonial authority questions them, why are you fighting? And here are some of the examples of why they might be fighting. You'll see in line 20, there are a list of possible reasons that someone might be engaged in non-state sanctioned violence in the bush. This man is a coward, he's a sorcerer, he's a perjurer, he steals also, he is a thief, he is a cannibal. Again, reinforcing these colonial ideas of Indigenous people, these ideas of conflict as central to the ways that they engage with each other and the ways that they engage with colonial authorities. The village official, who is unnamed and very little described in this text, is someone who is asking for the truth in line 27. Tell me the truth. And you see these reactions. I didn't do it. I was crazy. I was running amok. And you see these commands that are given from line 34 and line 35, a threat. And you can see that this whole script resumes in or concludes in line 37 after these threats, after this mounting of this expedition into the interior, this kind of fictional, this is a completely fictional account at this point, this fictional account that imagines what you might need to know as a GI going into the interior, promises that all the backwoods natives are peaceful again. So I share this with you guys and everyone in the audience to kind of take you through my own kind of dismay and surprise in some ways. Not surprised because I didn't know that there were racist colonial engagements in the Pacific. That's not it at all. But because I found myself as a Pacific Island Studies student and as a student of linguistics, shocked to find something presented without any context around it. Now, at this point, I often think about who might have thrown this out and who wanted to get rid of this at the end of the semester and why. But I'm really glad that I encountered this because it gave me an important lens to look at how my discipline has engaged with notions of race and how my discipline has perpetuated racist notions of Pacific Islanders in ways that harm people like me and probably people like you in the audience as well. What we see in this text is discursive subjugation and the presumption that Indigenous Pacific Islanders are always there to be surveilled and monitored and threatened. And though this is something from the 1940s, it's really important for us to take a look at it to help us understand the ways that we engage with race in the Pacific today. There are a couple of things that I'll just point out. This is the linguistics nerd in me who can't help but note some of these things. Throughout the entirety of the book, not just the punitive expedition text, when we look at the useful phrases and all of the things that are included in these documents, it's really fascinating that the second person, which is the pronoun you, so someone is directing to someone else who's hearing them, it usually shows up as part of a command. So there's not really any opportunity to hear you as someone that I want to hear from or someone that I'm questioning in a way that is not me interrogating you. There are some neutral questions, but they're usually for threats and chastisement. The other thing that's really interesting is that the use of the third person, so those are he and they pronouns in English, is commonly used in the form of an accusation. So you saw in that short text run of the punitive expedition that you hear people accusing each other. He is a sorcerer, he is a cannibal. It's interesting because you never hear the third person used to describe someone in a neutral term. And it's also really important that reading through these texts, Native people in so-called area Melanesia are referred to in two ways. Neutral, which I note always has a pejorative possibility. Sometimes they're just describing a person and they might use Kanaka or Native, but that always has the potential to have an attachment of a threat or violence. And then there's also things that are very clearly anti-Black and pejorative in talking about people who might be using Melanesian Pidgin. And there are things in this text, in this linguistics document, and this thing that's produced by the United States military, supposedly to help their GIs navigate the new social and cultural space, the places that they were traversing during the Pacific theater of World War II. We see terms like pickaninny, monkey, and boy, which I've talked about previously. It's also really interesting that white people, usually without any other context, are generically referred to as master. And this is something that I think is quite shocking to think about in the 21st century, but makes a lot of sense if we are digging into the colonial history of the Pacific and the ways that anti-Blackness has come along with our investigations into this region, especially from the perspective of academia. It's important and interesting as well when we look at these, that these conversations that occur above the level of the useful phrase. What I mean here is these conversations that Hall was having with potential readers of these documents, whether they be GIs or other linguists, they shape perceived power differential. Also, probably not a surprise to any of us here, but militarism preconceives power relationships. It has an idea that the American GI will be the most powerful and the one calling the shots and asking the questions. But it's also important that this particular text really underscores that these power relationships are instantiated through violence and the threat of violence. And this punitive expedition, this idea that these colonial agents will go into the bush and make their power known, is one really clear way to see that. And then this idea that the presence of Native people, in this case, Native people who are also presumed and expected to inhabit a stereotype of Blackness, are people who are sources of conflict themselves. And that part of what the colonial actor needs to attend to is that these natives have to be put in order. So this idea of conflict as integral to understanding who the Native is and how they operate. So at the beginning, we talked about who raced the islands and talked about the ways that the French and other Europeans and Euro-Americans in their wake have been really invested in categorizing this place and making divisions, not only between culture areas, but also thinking about the kinds of organizations of societies and potential colonial power they might be able to extend. And I found in thinking about this conversation today that there's a kind of a countervailing phenomenon happening right now. So when we talk about who raced the islands, we see something different when we think about the ways that people have been calling us to think about the ocean itself. And of course, there are people like Apeli Hau'ofa, who's invited us to think about our Sea of Islands and that the ocean is not necessarily something that separates us, but rather something that connects us. And they're important thinkers and scholars and culture producers. And someone here on the slide that I always want to honor whenever we talk about Blackness in the Pacific is Teresia Teowa, whose important and influential poem and all of her work highlighted the ways that we think about Blackness in this region. And from our vantage here in the Pacific, think about global connections to Blackness and colonial experiences. If you haven't read Black in the Blue Pacific, and I'm sure many in the audience have, I advise you to do it. It's a short poem and something that I think really speaks to the heart of a lot of experiences that we have across this region. And I think asks us some hard questions about how we consume each other, how we understand each other's colonial experiences, and what it might mean for us to advocate for our freedom in various spaces. When I think about who's racing the oceans, I also think about this kind of new turn in Pacific Island studies and in Black studies and the places that they converge. Of course, I'm thinking about things like The Black Atlantic by Paul Gilroy, which came out in 1993. And it was an attempt on Gilroy's part to really think about the ocean as a generative space. He's thinking about the Atlantic world and the ways that the crossings and culture mixing and syncretism that people who were trafficked as a part of the Atlantic slave trade really used to create not just their own experience as Black people who were caught up and who were objects and subjects being transported across the ocean, but actually as agents of change, and how they were able to change not only the places where they landed, but also the places that they left from, and recreated a world that connected Africa, the Caribbean, North America, and Europe, and South America as well, in a way that created a completely different understanding of how culture works and what culture could be. And even in the bowels of a slave ship, people were able to carry their humanity with them and assert it in new places and in new ways. And so Gilroy's work has been deeply influential in Black studies. And I think in the last several years, there's been this turn to kind of use this analogy of the Black Pacific to imagine and try to understand a Black Atlantic, I'm sorry, to understand a Black Pacific. There are interesting works like Gerald Horne's historical treatment of the post 1865 experience coming from the United States to the Pacific, and how some of the racialized ideas, many of the racialized ideas that were held by Confederates and other white supremacists came to Hawaii and across the Pacific as they tried to bring their logics of racial capitalism as their kind of hold on the economies of the places where they had been well established in the United States and the Caribbean, in the Americas, was changing racialized white supremacist ideas here, not only here to Hawaii, but to Fiji and Australia, and establishing sugar plantations and other kinds of plantation racialized spaces to be able to extract maximum value. And it's important, back to this earlier definition of race, that race is a tool and an excuse and a pretext for creating an extractive relationship with the islands that they encounter. And I think Horne does a really great job of that. Of course, just a few years ago, Robbie Shilliam borrowed some of the ideas from the Black Atlantic to mount a concept of a Black Pacific. And this book in particular has been criticized, not least because the idea of Black Pacific looks at the Pacific as a place of solidarity and potential solidarity with the Black Atlantic, while leaving out the experiences of Black, Indigenous, Pacific Islanders. And that's a criticism that I know Shilliam has heard. And in conversation with him, I know that's something that he's trying to think through. But it's important that, you know, one of the pieces of 2015's The Black Pacific is this erasure of Indigenous Pacific Islanders who are also Black. One of the things that I think is starting to change that is a recent book that came out just last year by Kido Swan that looks at the experience and the intentional solidarity building that a Black Atlantic person, Paulu Kamarakafego, who's from Bermuda, brought with him into the Pacific and his engagement specifically around environmental science. And in Paulu's diaspora, we see a really different shift. We see a shift from the Pacific as kind of a metaphor and a place where people are in some ways like the older versions of a Black Atlantic. People were just trafficked through space, to seeing something that actually has intentional connections between people in Vanuatu and the Caribbean and Africa, all engaged in decolonial struggles and really thinking about what it will look like, not only when the French leave and the English leave, but when we actually have sovereignty and opportunities to control how we maintain and manage our resources. And so I think it's really striking to me that as we're thinking about these new turns where people talk about the Black Atlantic, the White Pacific, the Black Pacific, and this diaspora beyond, that we're seeing people of color engaged in scholarship, trying to reckon with their relationships with the ocean and the space in between. And I don't think that that's something that we should take for granted. It's required a lot of intellectual and scholarly work and political commitments on the part of these folks who are trying to kind of make these connections in a way that allows the ocean, which has been invisibilized and represented as just a thoroughfare, a key actor in the ways that we connect to each other, but also the solidarity that could potentially arise from us being connected across vast distances. Of course, thinking about talking with you all today, I am very aware of possibly one of the reasons that I've been asked to be a part of this conference, and especially in this moment as we try to navigate unfamiliar seas, is this kind of new emerging discourse of solidarity between Pacific Islanders, Black people, and what it might mean for us in a global way. Of course, you've probably seen, if you're on social media, there are lots of memes. This was something that was circulating in the last several years, even before the events of 2020. But during 2020, we saw massive protests. These are two images from Aotearoa, where people are in the streets demonstrating in support of the Black Lives Matter movement, particularly calling for justice in the wake of the murder of George Floyd in Minnesota. So you can imagine miles and miles away on the other side of the world, people identifying with George Floyd for various reasons. And we saw this amazing upswell. Some people have attributed that to our experiences of isolation during the pandemic, and I think that that's certainly part of it. But I also think that there's been really important intentional work that activists, communities, and others have been doing, trying to think about the similar experiences that Black people have and Pacific Islanders share, including Black Pacific Islanders, thinking about the ways people have mobilized around protecting small island states and the impending climate disaster that we're all experiencing now. We also saw some of these kind of conflicted presentations here in Hawaii. And Hawaii is a really interesting space because though we are in the Pacific, we're also militarily occupied by the United States. And there's been a really complicated culture history in Hawaii. So you'll see an image on the left that's from Facebook, protests that were happening across North America in defense of George Floyd, where people were contrasting the movement to protect Mauna Kea with the uprisings that were happening across North America. There have been many engagements that we've had at the Pōpolo Project and in some of the work that we've been doing since the summer to really help people contextualize what is really different about these movements, what's the same, and where there are opportunities for solidarity. But initially, these were the kinds of images that were circulating around. People saying, you know, there's no reason for people to be engaged in what they called violence. But I think it's really important for these conversations to underscore that Black Lives Matter and global Black movements for liberation are contending with acute violence. And I think the example that we saw from the punitive expedition text and the Melanesian Pidgin phrase book and vocabulary demonstrates that caught up in these ideas of Blackness, whether we're talking about people of African descent or Indigenous Pacific Islanders who are raised as Black, there's this implication of the threat of violence all the time. And that people were not just reacting to a kind of theoretical or abstract, kind of political moment, but they were really feeling like they were mobilized to defend human life. And in the same way, people who have been organizing and working for Mauna Kea for many years, this is a ongoing struggle, figured out the tactics and the positions that made the most sense in their own cultural context and for the defense of the mountain. And so, I think this last year has brought up opportunities for us to have interesting and important conversations about how we do want to organize and style our solidarity going forward. But it is interesting to me, and you'll see on this placard on the right, that as people were putting together ideas of the names that they wanted to say and the people they wanted to remember killed by state violence and by vigilantes, Black Lives Matter also includes at the bottom, this person added 2 Hawaiian men who were killed and whose murderers have not necessarily received justice. So I think it's important and an interesting intersection point for us to continue to look for. Of course, we saw demonstrations throughout Hawaii this summer. One of the largest demonstrations that's happened led by young high school students. But we saw many, many manifestations of people's grief and rage and sympathy and aloha that came out onto the streets. And it was an interesting time for us to kind of understand what it might mean for us as folks who are trying to look across not only the Pacific, but across the world and find solidarity with each other. Something that popped up and I think is really interesting is also this story from the Los Angeles Times in July of 2020. It says that George Floyd's death inspires a unlikely movement in Indonesia. I don't know how unlikely it is if you've been following what's been happening in West Papua, but I think it's also really important that the visibility of the struggle and the ways that people have been organizing and fighting, and also victims of violence, has been obscured in some ways by the Blackness and the presentation of the people who live there in Western media. And I think that, Papuan Lives Matter, or this unlikely movement in Indonesia is not as unlikely if you've been paying attention to the ways that things have been unfolding over the past several decades. And then one final thing that I'll share here is an interesting panel that I had the pleasure of moderating for the Sundance Film Festival. It's online, you can check it out, it's still freely available through the Honolulu Museum of Art. And this was an interesting conversation where we brought together people from the Caribbean. We brought together Indigenous Fijian person, Itauke. We brought together a Black Hawaiian person, myself of African-American ancestry, and another African-American person, to talk about what it means for us to intentionally try to cultivate solidarity and thinking about the ways that we recognize each other, the ways that we see the kind of presentation of Blackness in a non-colonial way. We see it as an opportunity for us to develop kinship with each other and to advocate for each other. If you're interested in that particular conversation, it's a couple hours long. It's still available online, and I'd be happy to direct you there. So I've been talking to you about linguistics and about finding trash in boxes and applying a racial lens to them. And I am interested in, and part of the goal of this conversation this afternoon is to really advocate for adding a racial lens to the work that we do in the Pacific. I think it's really important because there's some things that we would miss. There's some shapings, there are some constructions of the way that our knowledge is produced that wouldn't make sense unless we had a racial lens. I think there are a few things that are really useful for us. One is that it opens up new conversations on the technologies of colonialism. And what I mean by technology is not just the machines, but also the kinds of colonial logics that organize people into categories and help tell colonial agents and others, settlers and others, who is available for extraction, whose land is worth pillaging, and who needs to be listened to. And it's important to have this presentation of Blackness and to think about the ways that Atlantic ideas about Blackness and Black people have been imported into this place, because it really helps us see what some of their strategies are and what are opportunities for us to organize and mobilize against those things. It's also really important, looking at the Pacific, that we realize that indigeneity cannot be uncoupled from Blackness. And this is something that's really challenging in a lot of spaces that I inhabit, and especially talking about this work. But anti-Blackness fundamentally is anti-Indigenous. And it's important that when we talk about Blackness and indigeneity, that we don't present them as mutually exclusive. It's not just about Indigenous and Black solidarity, but understanding that different ones of us are positioned in different ways. And I think looking at the Pacific and looking at Blackness in the Pacific really calls us to reckon with the ways that indigeneity and Blackness exist together, and in fact co-constitute each other, and are important for understanding the colonial project and how colonization has been able to move forward in the last several hundred years. It's also important that genealogy and kinship are tools to counter colonialism. And I think the Pacific gives us examples of this when we think about our kinship to land, when we think about our relationship to the places that we're from and where our lineages are rooted. Again, connected to this concept of indigeneity not being uncoupled from Blackness, but also understanding that genealogy in the Pacific context, but also in a worldwide context, gives us a lot of agency to make new kin and that we see this in the global Black, kind of cultural proclivity to name people brother and sister, that when we actually invest in making kinship relationships, we undo the work that colonization has done to separate us and to put us in categories where we're not able to assert those valuable relationships. And then I think the final thing that I'll share here about why I think an analysis of race in Pacific Island studies is so crucial is that it allows us to reposition marginalized scholars and their scholarship. And I started off the talk this afternoon sharing about an experience that I had as a graduate student where I was marginalized in the classroom, and my Blackness and my Black body and my face and my hair and my lineage were used as a teaching tool in a way that objectified me and removed me as a speaking voice and as an agent and as a scholar contributing to an important conversation. And I think we have to make sure that we have a racial lens in the work that we're doing, whether it's in linguistics or in any other field, because it helps us understand how power works and how power moves and who gets to speak about the Pacific or any other place. And it's crucial that we start having these conversations out loud and upfront at every chance that we get. So with all of that on our plate, how do we navigate? One of the things that I think is really important as we go forward, and some of this is taking a little bit from the work of people who've invested in the important and inspiring navigation that's traditional to the Pacific, we have to first make sure that our structures are sound, whether that is our vaka or the institutions that we support. We have to make sure, if we're going to navigate an unfamiliar sea, that we understand where we're going and how we're going to get there, but also what's going to carry us there. We also have to carry and care for culture. From the Pacific wayfaring examples, so much of the knowledge is not encoded in a map, right? These are things that are passed down from generation to generation through song, through saying, through different kinds of mnemonics that people have managed for thousands of years. And it's important for us to do that if we're going to continue to go forward. Thinking about solidarity between Black people of African descent, Pacific Islanders, and the rest of the world, we have to also understand that culture is our cure. Culture is one of the avenues that we have to connect with each other across our difference, across our different experiences. We've seen that over and over again in the recent centuries, that we can hear each other's song, whether it's reggae music or hip hop, or watch each other dance and recognize the humanity in the other person. It's an important entry point for us to be able to navigate what's going to be coming. And because of that, because of caring for culture and recognizing each other's humanity, we have to pay attention to our relationships, whether they're relationships between an individual and a community or the land. These are sources for us to really figure out what's happening all around us, just like navigators and voyagers are paying attention to the relationships between different environmental phenomena and currents. We have to pay attention to the environmental, cultivate and maintain those relationships, and be open for learning and be open for different kinds of engagement. And then we have to be ready to observe what the Blackness holds. Just as when we think about celestial navigation in the Pacific, celestial navigation is a longstanding ancient tradition in Africa and the diaspora as well. And what we know from our ancestors is that while we might be small and while we might be specifically in a place on this earth, that the night sky and the celestial bodies that are there help us orient ourselves. And a lot of scholars, there are many important and brilliant scholars now working on concepts of pole in the Pacific and thinking about generative Blackness as a place for us to really root ourselves and start to look at possibilities to come. But we should trust and understand that there are lessons to be learned from the vastness of a consciousness and experience that's beyond ours. And finally, as we try to navigate, part of what we have to do is visualize our destination. This is something that you hear from all of the great navigators, that not only are they paying attention to what's changing around them, not only do they have a mnemonic that tells them which way to go, they actually engage in imagining what it will be like to arrive. And I think that's something that we have to think about as well if we're going to find opportunities for true liberation and responsible scholarship and interesting and emancipatory work in culture. We have to be able to imagine what it would be like when we get there. So where do we find ourselves? We find ourselves here. We find ourselves now. We find ourselves in spaces like this one at this Center for Pacific Island Students Conference, asking questions about not only where we are right now, but where we'd like to go. And I know I've kind of ranged a little bit in this keynote, but I'm really interested in hearing from those in the audience who maybe some of the pieces have resonated with you, and maybe there's some questions as well. But I'll end there, and we'll open it up for the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Dr. Glenn. That was very much appreciated, and I enjoyed it. We have a little bit of time for a Q&A, so if people have questions, please feel free to add them to the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. We have a couple of questions already, two of which are fairly close related. The first one is, last year in Hawaii, there seemed to be a wonderful outpouring of support for the Black Lives Matter movement in light of ongoing and more recent racialized acts of violence, such as the George Floyd and other killings. Yet, racism within and between Pacific communities persists here. Micronesians in Hawaii are particularly subject to both institutional racism and racism from their fellow Pacific Islanders. As Pacific communities rise in solidarity to support anti-racism movements across the nation, what do you think facilitates ongoing racism within and between Pacific communities?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question and a very important one. I think that the shortest answer and the most direct answer is that racism benefits someone, right? So even if people are moved morally to be in solidarity with people who are not necessarily immediately here, the attacks on Micronesian people in our community are part of the ongoing colonization and kind of colonial mindset that has been entrenched in Hawaii. And so I think one of the things that we can do is the framing and the discourses around Micronesian people, but also other Pacific Islanders and other communities here in Hawaii have been framed. I often give talks on race in Hawaii, and one of the things that I've done recently is kind of pull up the stereotypes of Micronesian people and match them against stereotypes of Black people. And I find that a lot of people in Hawaii are appalled to realize that things that they've circulated about or circulated, participated in, or repeated about Pacific Islanders, they would never say about Black people, because there has been a long and established kind of tradition and movement to push back on some of those narratives, specifically around Black people, but we don't necessarily recognize that when we're talking about other communities. So one example that I always give is a couple of years ago, there was a Chuukese boy who was killed by his neighbor, Starsky Willie, in Kalihi. And Starsky was supposedly suspected of burglarizing the house of his neighbor, and he was killed, shot, just like Trayvon Martin was. And when that particular story ended up in the Hawaii news, they darkened the child's skin. He was 16 years old. They showed him in images where he's wearing a hoodie. It was almost textbook, the way that Black youth are vilified, especially in talking about police-involved killings or vigilante-involved killings, and certainly in the case of Trayvon Martin. And so when I bring that up to people, one of the first things is that they might have heard about this child being murdered by his neighbor, but they didn't pay attention to it once they heard that he was Chuukese. And that's something that is really important to be able to call people's attention to. So I think part of it is continuing to push our community and make these parallels very explicit to people.
Thank you. We have another question, one here from Shannon. She asks, what do you see as the greatest need for growth to understand the connectedness of not just solidarity between indigeneity and Blackness?
That's a great question too. One of the things that I love to talk about, and we certainly don't have time today, but talking about the origins of the concept of Indigenous and Black in the Atlantic world and as an early part of the colonial process. I maybe folks have heard me talk about this in other places, but my ancestry comes from the area that's now called Virginia. And I have African and Indigenous ancestors who in the 1600s were both enslaved in the same place. And you see this as kind of this origin point where there's a question of how do we dispossess people of land and how do we extract labor from people. And when you go back to the origin of these kind of colonial moves, you see that there was so much intentional kind of back and forth engagement on that. And it's not that Black people are not Indigenous or Indigenous people can't be Black, but rather, are we talking about relationship to land, or are we talking about expropriation of labor? And you see in the early colonial period that a lot of those things collapse. And certainly in the, as I mentioned, in the area where my family's from, there were lots and lots of Indigenous people who were enslaved and shipped away from their homes to places in the Caribbean. And you see in the manifests that they're written and considered Black the moment that they become expropriated from their land and that their labor becomes extractable. So I think one of the things that's important and useful is for us to go back to the early history of these terms, and also to understand that when you're talking about Indigenous people or Black people, these are not necessarily terms that we've chosen for ourselves or coalitions that we've chosen for ourselves. They're circumstances that we find ourselves in relationship to colonial structures and extractive capital. And so I think going back to those roots is really helpful.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more, possibly two. This one's short, but it might have a long answer. So the question is, can you speak about Blackness and anti-Blackness in a local context here in Hawaii compared to the mainland?
Sure. I mean, there's lots to be said, so I will try to keep it short. First, there's anti-Blackness here. I think that, to be really frank, I think a lot of the ways that our Micronesian community members are treated are rooted in anti-Blackness. I think a lot of the discourses that people engage with around their presence in Hawaii have to do with deep-seated anti-Blackness that's a part of local culture as a result of the occupation. And not just the occupation, but the fact that there's a large military presence here. The military has a long and sordid history of kind of promulgating those kinds of ideas. So I think that's one place that I always want to start. There is anti-Blackness against people like me who not only are considered Black, but identify as Black. Not just saying that Blackness is the metaphorical thing that, you know, that Micronesians or other people are kind of painted with. There's a lot of anti-Black violence in Hawaii that goes unreported because it's not as severe as people experience or expect in North America. And I can say in my vantage, working at the Pōpolo Project and being kind of a hub for our community, this last year we've heard a number of violent incidents, especially directed at Black women in public spaces, especially around the time of the election. Certainly throughout the summer with all the uprisings that were happening. So it's here. I think one of the questions that we have to ask is why we don't hear about it as much. I think, of course, part of that is a function of the size of our communities. We're about 2%, people of African descent are about 2% of the population. There's a small Melanesian presence here in Hawaii. Micronesian folks are around 2%, depending on the group that you're looking at. And you see that part of the reason that you don't hear about it is because we actually don't have that much power in social spaces. So I think one of the things that's different is that here in Hawaii, we just have not had the space and the kind of historical experience to be able to mount a platform to talk about some of the things that we experience. Now, that's not to say that the same kinds of things are happening on a regular basis that you see in North America. Certainly, we're not seeing the same kinds of you know, violence against Black people at the hands of police here in Hawaii, but we do actually see Black folks being overrepresented when police in Honolulu use force against citizens. And so I think that's a really important thing to realize, that you might not see the same kind of patterns that you expect in a place like California or on the East Coast of the US, but those things are still happening here. And the question is, why are they hard to find, or why are they hard to hear on a regular basis?
Thank you so much for that. So we're about out of time, and I want to thank Dr. Akiemi Glenn, so much for your contribution. I think all of us gained a lot from it. And I want to thank all of the attendees, participants as well. And this will close out the, unless you have anything else that you wanted to add, of course, Dr. Glenn. Okay, this will close out our first day of the 9th annual CPIS student conference. And again, I just want to thank Dr. Glenn so much for her contribution. And tomorrow we will begin at 9 a.m. and we will have another keynote, Dr. Wilfred Alik. So please come around for that as well. And thank you all so much. And again, thank you, Dr. Glenn.